The radio crackled with static as Special Agent Maria Santos pressed her earpiece closer. All units, this is command. We have visual confirmation of 17 hostages inside the warehouse. Repeat, 17 souls counting on us to bring them home tonight. The autumn rain pelted against the bulletproof windows of the mobile command center, each drop seeming to echo the urgency of the situation unfolding just 200 yards away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What started as a routine drug bust in Detroit's industrial district had spiraled into something far more dangerous. The Hernandez cartel, cornered and desperate, had transformed a simple warehouse into a fortress of fear. Inside, bound and terrified, were not just rival gang members as initially suspected, but innocent civilians, dock workers, security guards, and a cleaning crew who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Agent Santos had seen her share of hostage situations in her 12 years with the FBI's hostage rescue team, but something about this one felt different. The intel was murky. Communications with the hostage takers had been sporadic at best, and worst of all, they were operating on borrowed time. Local police had received reports of explosives inside the building, though none of their surveillance equipment had been able to confirm the threat. "Santos, what's your read on this?" came the voice of Commander James Mitchell through her headset. Mitchell was a 20-year veteran who'd earned his stripes in some of the Bureau's most high-profile rescues, and his calm demeanor in crisis situations had become legendary among the team. Maria adjusted her scope, scanning the warehouse's second-floor windows for any sign of movement. "Sir, I count at least 4 tangos on the ground floor, possibly more on the upper level. They're well armed and they know we're here. The hostages appear to be concentrated in the main floor's eastern section, but visibility is limited." The warehouse, a relic from Detroit's industrial heyday, stretched nearly 3 city blocks. Its red brick facade was pockmarked with broken windows, some boarded up, others offering perfect sniping positions for both law enforcement and the criminals inside. The building's age worked against them. Thick walls made thermal imaging difficult, and the maze-like interior provided countless places for armed hostiles to take cover. Lieutenant Danny Rodriguez, the team's explosives expert, jogged up to the command vehicle, water dripping from his tactical gear. "Commander, I've got bad news. Our ground-penetrating radar is picking up what looks like multiple pressure-sensitive devices throughout the building. If these guys rigged this place to blow, one wrong step could bring the whole structure down on top of everyone inside." The weight of those words settled over the command center like a heavy blanket. 17 innocent lives hung in the balance, and now they had confirmation that the building itself had been weaponized. Traditional entry methods, flashbangs, breaching charges, even coordinated simultaneous entries could trigger a catastrophic explosion. Agent Santos lowered her binoculars and turned to Commander Mitchell. "What's our timeline, sir? How long before local PD expects us to move?" Mitchell glanced at his watch, the luminous digits reading 11:47 p.m. "Mayor's office is breathing down everyone's neck. News crews are already setting up 3 blocks out, and we've got family members of the hostages gathering at the police barriers. Department brass wants resolution by dawn, but I'm more concerned about keeping everyone alive than meeting political deadlines." Through the warehouse's main entrance, a figure appeared, silhouetted against the interior lighting, clearly armed, making deliberate gestures towards the law enforcement vehicles. It was Carlos Hernandez himself, the cartel leader who'd turned a simple drug operation into this nightmare scenario. "Command, this is Overwatch." The voice belonged to Agent Sarah Kim, positioned on a rooftop 4 blocks east with a clear line of sight into several of the warehouse windows. "Primary target is showing himself. I have partial visual on what appears to be hostages in the background. Subjects appear to be zip-tied and seated along the eastern wall." The radio fell silent for a moment as everyone processed the information. 17 people, bound and helpless, their lives depending on decisions made by a team of law enforcement professionals who understood that one miscalculation could result in tragedy on an unimaginable scale. Commander Mitchell's voice cut through the tension. "All right, people, we're dealing with a sophisticated enemy in a compromised structure with innocent lives at stake. I want all entry team leaders to report to the command vehicle in 5 minutes. We're going to walk through every possible scenario, examine every option, and find a way to bring those hostages home safely." As the various team leaders began converging on the mobile command center, Maria Santos couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more complex than a standard hostage rescue. The Hernandez cartel was known for their ruthlessness, but taking civilian hostages and rigging buildings with explosives suggested a level of desperation that made them exponentially more dangerous. The rain continued to fall, washing the city streets clean, while inside that warehouse, 17 people waited for salvation, unaware that their rescue would soon become one of the most controversial operations in FBI history.
The tactical briefing began at midnight sharp, with all team leaders crowded into the mobile command center. The air was thick with tension and the smell of strong coffee, fuel for what everyone knew would be a long, difficult night. Commander Mitchell stood before a large monitor displaying the warehouse's blueprint, red dots marking known hostage positions and suspected explosive devices. "Gentlemen and ladies," Mitchell began, his voice carrying the weight of command, "we're looking at what could be the most challenging rescue operation this team has ever undertaken. Intelligence suggests Carlos Hernandez and his men have been planning this contingency for months. This isn't a desperate last stand, it's a carefully orchestrated trap." Agent David Park, leader of the primary entry team, raised his hand. "Commander, what's our confidence level on the explosive devices? Are we talking about simple pipe bombs or something more sophisticated?" Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped forward, consulting his tablet. "Based on our scans and what little intelligence we've gathered, we're likely dealing with C4 or a similar plastic explosive. The signatures suggest they're wired to pressure plates throughout the building, possibly with remote detonation capability as well. In other words, Hernandez can bring the building down with the push of a button, or we can trigger it accidentally if we step in the wrong place." The implications were staggering. Traditional hostage rescue protocols relied heavily on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Flashbang grenades, breaching charges, and coordinated simultaneous entries through multiple access points. All of these standard tactics could potentially trigger the explosives and kill everyone inside. Agent Santos leaned forward in her chair. "What about negotiation? Have we made contact with Hernandez? Maybe we can buy time, get some of the hostages released." FBI negotiator Patricia Valdez shook her head grimly. "I've been trying for 2 hours. He answered once, made some demands about safe passage to Mexico and a helicopter, then went silent. Our behavioral analysis suggests he's not interested in negotiating. This is his final stand, and he's planning to take as many people with him as possible." The warehouse had become a tomb, and everyone in that command center knew it. 17 innocent people were trapped inside with armed killers and enough explosives to level a city block. Every minute that passed increased the likelihood that Hernandez would decide to end the standoff on his own terms. Agent Kim's voice crackled through the radio from her overwatch position. "Command, I'm seeing increased activity on the second floor. Looks like they're moving the hostages, possibly consolidating them in a different area." Mitchell immediately turned to the monitor, zooming in on the warehouse's second floor. "Rodriguez, what's the explosive situation up there?" "Unknown, sir. Our equipment can't penetrate that far into the building with any accuracy. We're essentially flying blind on the upper levels." The team fell into an uncomfortable silence, each member running through possible scenarios in their minds. The textbook approaches weren't going to work. They needed something creative, something the hostage takers wouldn't expect, and something that could be executed without triggering the explosives. Agent Park broke the silence. "What about a diversion? If we can draw their attention to one side of the building, maybe we can get a small team in through an alternate entry point." And trigger every pressure plate between here and the hostages? Rodriguez shook his head. These guys aren't amateurs. They've had hours to prepare for exactly that kind of approach. Commander Mitchell studied the blueprint intently, his finger tracing possible entry routes. What about the old steam tunnels? This district has an extensive underground system from the 1940s. Rodriguez, can you get me a map of the tunnel network? Within minutes, Rodriguez had pulled up a detailed schematic of Detroit's forgotten underground infrastructure. The steam tunnels, originally built to supply heat to the industrial district, ran directly beneath the warehouse. More importantly, they predated the building by several decades, meaning any explosives would be above them. There, Mitchell pointed to a section of the blueprint, tunnel access point approximately 50 yards from the warehouse's foundation. If we can breach up through the basement floor, we might be able to avoid the explosive devices entirely. Agent Santos felt a spark of hope for the first time all evening. How long would it take to get a team through those tunnels? The tunnels themselves aren't the problem, Rodriguez replied, pulling up additional schematics. The challenge is breaching through the warehouse's basement floor without alerting the hostage takers. We'd need to cut through concrete and steel support beams, and that's going to make noise. The plan was audacious and risky, but it offered something the other approaches didn't, a way to potentially reach the hostages without walking through a minefield. However, it would require split-second timing, precise coordination, and more than a little luck. Agent Park leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. Even if we get into the basement undetected, we still have to reach the hostages on the main floor. That means stairs, doorways, and all the choke points where these explosives are likely concentrated. Mitchell nodded grimly, which is why we're going to need a simultaneous diversion. Something big enough to draw their attention, but not so dramatic that it triggers the explosives. As the team began working through the details of what would later be known as Operation Angel 9, none of them could have predicted how drastically wrong things would go, or how a single phrase, Angel 9 taking the shot, would echo through law enforcement circles for years to come. The clock on the command center wall read 12:47 a.m. In less than 5 hours, the sun would rise on Detroit, and 17 families would either be reunited with their loved ones or beginning the worst day of their lives.
The steam tunnels beneath Detroit's industrial district hadn't seen human activity in decades. As Agent Park led his four-man team through the narrow, rust-stained passages, their tactical lights cut through darkness that seemed almost solid. The air was thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water, and every footstep echoed ominously through the underground maze. "Command, this is Entry Team Alpha," Park whispered into his throat microphone. "We're approximately 30 yards from the breach point. Rodriguez, how are we looking on the cutting equipment?" Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice came through clearly, despite the interference from all the metal surrounding them. "Thermal lance is ready to go, but remember, once we start cutting, you'll have maybe 10 minutes before the noise becomes impossible to ignore. Even with the warehouse's background noise, someone's going to notice." Above them, the warehouse loomed like a concrete and steel tomb. Intelligence suggested that Carlos Hernandez had positioned his men strategically throughout the building, with the hostages concentrated on the main floor's eastern section. The explosive devices, according to their best estimates, were primarily focused on the ground floor and main entry points, areas where law enforcement would traditionally attempt to rescue. Agent Santos, monitoring from her sniper position 2 blocks away, provided regular updates. "Angel 9 to command. I have eyes on second floor movement. Looks like 2 tangos patrolling the upper level, but I still can't get a clear count on total hostiles." The designation Angel 9 had been Santos's call sign for 3 years, earned during a previous operation where her precision shooting had saved a family of 4 from armed kidnappers. Tonight, that same precision might be the difference between life and death for 17 innocent people. Commander Mitchell's voice crackled through all team frequencies. "All units, we're approaching the critical phase. Entry Team Alpha, you're green for breach. Diversionary Team Beta, prepare to create noise on the building's west side in exactly 8 minutes. Remember, people, we get one shot at this."
Park's team had reached the breach point directly beneath the warehouse's basement floor. Above them, layers of concrete, steel rebar, and decades of industrial grime separated them from their objective. Rodriguez had calculated that they would need to cut through approximately 18 inches of material, a process that would generate significant heat, noise, and debris. "All right, team," Park addressed his men in barely audible whispers. "Johnson, you're on point once we're through. Williams, cover the rear. Martinez, you're with me on hostage location and extraction. Remember, according to the blueprints, we'll emerge into a storage area in the basement northeast corner. From there, we have approximately 40 feet to the stairwell leading to the main floor." Special Agent Johnson, a former Army Ranger with extensive urban warfare experience, checked his weapon one last time. "Rules of engagement, sir?" Park replied, "Protect the hostages at all costs. Secondary priority is neutralizing threats, but remember, any gunfire could potentially trigger those explosives. We're going to need to be surgical about this." Above ground, Agent Kim maintained her overwatch position, her high-powered scope trained on the warehouse's various windows. "Command, I'm seeing what looks like increased agitation among the hostiles. They know something is happening, but they can't figure out what." The truth is that Carlos Hernandez and his men were growing increasingly paranoid as the hours wore on. They had expected a traditional assault, SWAT teams rappelling from helicopters, armored vehicles crashing through the main entrance, or tear gas canisters being lobbed through windows. The fact that law enforcement seemed to be holding back was making them nervous, and nervous criminals were dangerous criminals. "Entry Team Alpha, begin breach," commanded Mitchell. The thermal lance ignited with a brilliant, white-hot flame that could cut through steel like butter. Rodriguez had modified the equipment to minimize noise, but even so, the sound of superheated metal meeting concrete was unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. In the warehouse above, Carlos Hernandez was pacing near the bound hostages when he heard the first sounds of cutting from below. His experience running drug operations had taught him to recognize the distinctive noise of industrial equipment, and his eyes immediately went to the basement access door. "Miguel," he shouted to one of his lieutenants, "check the basement, now!" As Miguel descended the stairs to investigate, Park's team was making rapid progress through the concrete floor. The thermal lance was performing better than expected, and they were already 3/4 of the way through the barrier. Agent Santos, monitoring from her sniper position, noticed the change in activity immediately. "Command, we have movement toward the basement area. 1 Tango heading down from the main floor." Mitchell's voice carried new urgency. "Entry Team Alpha, how long until breach?" 90 seconds, Command, Park responded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool underground temperature. Those 90 seconds would prove to be the longest minute and a half in the operations timeline. Miguel, armed with an AK-47 and increasingly suspicious about the noises emanating from the basement floor, was moving methodically through the lower level, checking every room and storage area. The cutting was almost complete when the inevitable happened. Miguel rounded a corner and came face to face with the brilliant light of the thermal lance cutting upward through the concrete. His shouts of alarm echoed throughout the warehouse, immediately alerting every hostile in the building that law enforcement had found a way inside. "Command, we're blown." Park's urgent whisper carried over the radio. "Tango in the basement. Hostiles are alerted. We need that diversion now." The carefully planned operation had just become a desperate race against time.
The warehouse erupted into chaos as Miguel's panicked shouts echoed through the building. "Están aquí! Están aquí abajo!" His voice carried the terror of a man who suddenly realized that the hunters had become the hunted. Agent Park made the decision that would haunt him for years to come. With their cover blown and Miguel raising the alarm, stealth was no longer an option. "Breach now," he commanded, and Johnson drove his shoulder hard against the partially cut section of concrete floor. The section gave way with a thunderous crash, sending chunks of concrete and twisted rebar cascading into the basement below. Johnson rolled through the opening, his weapon raised, just as Miguel rounded the corner with his AK-47 already firing. The basement became a storm of muzzle flashes and ricocheting bullets as the two men engaged in close-quarters combat. Johnson, with his military training, managed to get behind a concrete support pillar just as Miguel's wild spray stitched holes in the wall where he'd been standing moments before. "Command, we have contact in the basement." Park's voice was barely audible over the gunfire. "Miguel is down, but the entire building knows we're here." Above them, the warehouse had transformed into a fortress under siege. Carlos Hernandez screamed orders in rapid-fire Spanish while his remaining men took positions at windows and doorways. The 17 hostages, bound and terrified, could only listen to the sounds of impending battle while praying they wouldn't become casualties in the crossfire. Agent Santos, monitoring from her overwatch position, watched through her scope as armed figures moved frantically throughout the warehouse's upper floors. "Command, I count at least 6 tangos taking defensive positions. They're using the hostages as human shields." Commander Mitchell's voice carried the weight of a man watching his carefully planned operation disintegrate in real time. "All units, switch to Plan Delta. Entry Team Alpha, proceed with hostage location and extraction. Diversionary Team Beta, initiate noise discipline breach on the west wall. We need to divide their attention." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Plan Delta was the contingency they had all hoped never to use, a simultaneous multi-point entry that accepted significant risk in exchange for speed and surprise. With their cover blown and Miguel raising the alarm, stealth was no longer an option. Park's team moved swiftly through the basement, using the building's infrastructure to provide cover. The basement was larger than their blueprints had suggested, filled with abandoned machinery from the building's industrial past. Massive boilers and steam pipes created a maze-like environment that offered both concealment and the constant threat of being trapped. "Johnson, take point toward the main stairwell," Park instructed. "Williams, cover our 6. Martinez, stay close. We're going to need your Spanish when we reach the hostages." The stairwell leading to the main floor was narrow and exposed, exactly the kind of fatal funnel that military tacticians warned against. But with explosives potentially wired throughout the building, they had no choice but to take the direct route. Agent Kim's voice crackled through their earpieces from her overwatch position. "Entry Team Alpha, you have 2 tangos at the top of your stairwell. They're waiting for you." Park made a hand signal to his team. Johnson pulled out a flashbang grenade, but then hesitated. The potential for triggering explosives made even their standard non-lethal devices dangerous. "Negative on flashbang," Park whispered. "Rodriguez, what's your assessment on explosive sensitivity?" Lieutenant Rodriguez's reply was not encouraging. "Sir, based on the signatures we're reading, any significant percussion could trigger a chain reaction. We're essentially operating in a powder keg." The team was trapped between impossible choices: proceed without their standard tactical advantages, or risk bringing down the entire building on everyone inside. Park made the decision that separated effective leaders from hesitant ones. They would press forward using nothing but their training, their weapons, and their determination to save innocent lives. Meanwhile, on the main floor, Carlos Hernandez was making his own impossible choices. He had 17 hostages, enough explosives to level the building, and law enforcement closing in from below. His original plan had been to negotiate safe passage in exchange for releasing the hostages, but that plan had assumed he would maintain control of the situation. "Boss," called one of his lieutenants from a second-floor window, "more cops are surrounding the building. They've got snipers on the rooftops." Hernandez looked at the terrified faces of his captives, dock workers who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, security guards who had tried to do their jobs, cleaning staff who had been working late shifts to support their families. These people had nothing to do with his war against law enforcement, but they had become his only leverage. Agent Santos, monitoring from her overwatch position, watched through her scope as armed figures moved frantically throughout the warehouse's upper floors. Command, I count at least 6 tangos taking defensive positions. They're using the hostages as human shields. Commander Mitchell's voice carried the weight of a man watching his carefully planned operation disintegrate in real time. All units switch to Plan Delta. Entry Team Alpha, proceed with hostage location and extraction. Diversionary Team Beta, initiate noise discipline breach on the west wall. We need to divide their attention. The next few minutes would determine whether Operation Angel 9 would be remembered as a heroic rescue or one of the worst disasters in FBI history.
The stairwell stretched above them like a concrete throat, each step potentially their last. Agent Johnson moved with the fluid precision of a man who had faced death before, his weapon raised and ready as he approached the door leading to the main floor. Behind him, Park's team followed in perfect tactical formation, their training overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze them. At the top of the stairs, the door was slightly ajar, offering a narrow slice of view into the warehouse's main floor. Johnson could see shadows moving beyond, and more importantly, he could hear voices, both the harsh Spanish of the hostage takers and the terrified whimpers of their captives. "Command, this is Entry Team Alpha," Park whispered into his throat microphone. "We have visual confirmation of hostage voices, preparing to breach main floor." Agent Santos, maintaining her overwatch position, watched through her scope as the diversionary team prepared their own entry on the building's west side. "Command, diversionary team Beta is in position. On your mark." Commander Mitchell knew that the next few seconds would determine the fate of everyone inside that warehouse. Once both teams engaged simultaneously, there would be no turning back, no opportunity for second guessing, no chance to call for retreat. "All units, this is Command. Execute Plan Delta in 3, 2, 1, mark." The west wall of the warehouse exploded inward as diversionary Team Beta used a shaped charge to create their entry point. The blast was carefully calculated to be dramatic without triggering the building's explosive devices, but the sound was deafening, echoing through the structure like thunder. Carlos Hernandez spun toward the new breach, his weapon raised, screaming orders to his men. "La pared oeste! Todos a la pared oeste!" It was exactly what Park's team had hoped for. As the hostage takers rushed toward the western breach, Johnson kicked open the stairwell door, and his team poured onto the main floor like a tactical flood. The warehouse's interior was even more chaotic than their blueprints had suggested. Decades of industrial use had left the space cluttered with machinery, conveyor belts, and storage containers that created a maze of potential cover and concealment. The hostages were zip-tied to support pillars in the building's eastern section, exactly where intelligence had predicted. "Federal agents!" Johnson shouted as his team spread out tactically. "Nobody move!" But Hernandez was no amateur. Despite the confusion of the simultaneous breach, he immediately recognized the eastern assault for what it was, the real threat to his control of the situation. "Es una distracción!" he screamed to his men. "Los rehenes!" What happened next would be debated in after-action reports for years to come. Agent Martinez, fluent in Spanish and trained in hostage negotiation, attempted to establish communication with the terrified captives, but Johnson and Williams provided security overwatch. "Stay down, stay calm, we're here to help," Martinez called to the hostages in both English and Spanish. But as he moved toward the first group of bound civilians, Hernandez appeared from behind a machinery cluster, his weapon aimed directly at the helpless captives. "One more step and they all die," Hernandez shouted in heavily accented English, his finger on the trigger of an automatic weapon that could kill multiple hostages in seconds. The tactical situation had become a nightmare. Park's team had successfully reached the hostages, but they were now in a standoff with an armed killer who had nothing left to lose. Any aggressive move could result in multiple civilian casualties. Agent Santos, monitoring from her overwatch position, had a clear view through her scope of the standoff developing on the warehouse floor. Through the second-floor windows, she could see Hernandez with his weapon trained on the hostages, while Park's team maintained their positions behind various pieces of machinery. "Command, this is Angel 9.
Santos reported, her voice steady despite the tension. "I have a partial sight line on the primary target, but hostages are in the immediate danger zone. Any engagement risks civilian casualties." Commander Mitchell felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical force. 17 innocent lives hung in the balance, and every decision he made could mean the difference between a successful rescue and an unspeakable tragedy. The diversionary breach on the west wall had been successful in creating confusion, but it had also elevated the hostage-taker's desperation to dangerous levels. Hernandez was no longer thinking about escape or negotiation. He was focused solely on maintaining control through threats of violence. Agent Park, crouched behind a conveyor belt system approximately 20 feet from the hostages, could see the terror in the civilians' eyes. These were ordinary people. A janitor named Roberto, who had 3 children at home. A security guard named Patricia, who was 2 years from retirement. Dock workers who had families waiting for them to return from night shifts. Hernandez. Park called out, trying to establish dialogue. "Let's talk about this. Nobody else has to get hurt tonight." Hernandez's response was a burst of automatic weapon fire over the heads of the hostages, causing several of them to scream in terror. The message was clear. Any attempt to negotiate would be met with violence. The warehouse had become a pressure cooker, with armed law enforcement officers, desperate criminals, and innocent civilians all trapped together in a space rigged with enough explosives to kill everyone inside. Agent Santos, maintaining her sniper position, watched through her scope as the situation deteriorated with each passing second. Soon, Commander Mitchell would be forced to make the most difficult decision in law enforcement: whether to risk civilian lives in an attempt to save them.
Time seemed to stretch like elastic in the warehouse as the standoff entered its most critical phase. Agent Park could see sweat beading on Hernandez's forehead, despite the cool night air filtering through the building's broken windows. The cartel leader's grip on his weapon was tight, his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger, and his eyes darted constantly between the law enforcement officers and his helpless captives. "Boss," one of Hernandez's remaining men called from the western breach, "the cops outside, they're not advancing, they're just waiting." That observation sent a chill through everyone in the warehouse. Law enforcement didn't typically wait during active hostage situations unless they were planning something that required precise timing. Hernandez understood this better than most. He had survived years in the drug trade by anticipating his enemy's next moves. Agent Martinez, still crouched behind a machinery cluster, was studying the hostages' positions and trying to identify the best approach for their extraction. The 17 civilians were bound to support pillars in a rough line extending across the warehouse's eastern section, approximately 30 feet from where Park's team had taken cover. "Command, this is Entry Team Alpha," Park whispered into his throat microphone. "We need a clear directive. Subject is becoming increasingly agitated and civilian safety is deteriorating." Commander Mitchell, monitoring from the mobile command center, felt the crushing weight of leadership. Every decision he made would be scrutinized later by review boards, congressional committees, and the families of anyone who didn't make it home. But paralysis wasn't an option. Action, even imperfect action, was better than allowing the situation to spiral further out of control. Agent Santos, maintaining her overwatch position, had been studying the warehouse interior through her scope for over an hour. She had memorized every shadow, every piece of machinery, every potential line of fire. More importantly, she had been tracking Hernandez's movement patterns and behavioral tells. "Command, this is Angel 9, she reported, her voice steady and professional. "Primary target is showing signs of extreme stress. His movements are becoming more erratic, and he's repositioning frequently. Assessment is that he's preparing for a final action." The phrase "final action" carried ominous implications in law enforcement circles. It meant that Hernandez was likely planning to trigger the explosives, killing himself along with everyone else in the building, rather than surrendering to face justice. Inside the warehouse, one of the hostages, a dock worker named James Sullivan, was quietly working to free himself from the zip ties binding his wrists. Sullivan had 20 years of experience in manual labor, and his hands were strong and calloused from decades of physical work. More importantly, he understood that waiting for rescue might not be an option. Agent Johnson, positioned at the far end of Park's team formation, may notice Sullivan's subtle movements and made a tactical decision that would be later both praised and criticized. He began using hand signals to communicate with the hostage, indicating that Sullivan should continue his escape attempt but remain in position until given a signal to move. Hernandez, meanwhile, was growing increasingly paranoid about the silence from law enforcement. In his experience, quiet cops were dangerous cops, and the fact that no one was shooting at him suggested they were planning something more sophisticated than a simple gunfight. "Donde están?" he muttered to himself, scanning the shadows for hidden threats. "Where are you?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Agent Kim, maintaining her overwatch position on a rooftop 4 blocks away, had been tracking additional movement around the warehouse perimeter. "Command, we have a problem. I'm seeing what appears to be additional hostile personnel approaching from the north alley." The situation had just become exponentially more complex. If Hernandez had backup arriving, the carefully balanced standoff could explode into a full-scale battle, with the hostages caught directly in the crossfire. Park's team immediately shifted their positions to account for the new threat, but moving in the cluttered warehouse environment while maintaining visual contact with both Hernandez and the hostages required tactical precision that pushed their training to its limits. Entry Team Alpha, be advised that additional hostiles may be entering your area of operations. Commander Mitchell's voice carried new urgency. Maintain primary focus on hostage safety while preparing for expanded engagement. It was at that moment that James Sullivan made his move. Having worked free from his zip ties, he remained in position as instructed, but began quietly communicating with the other hostages, whispering instructions about staying low and moving quickly when the time came. Hernandez noticed the increased activity among his captives and immediately became suspicious. He moved closer to the hostages, his weapon raised, clearly prepared to use lethal force to maintain control. "Nobody moves," he screamed in accented English, loud enough for both the hostages and the law enforcement officers to hear clearly. "First person moves dies first." Agent Santos, watching through her scope from her overwatch position, saw Hernandez's finger tighten on the trigger. Her training had taught her to recognize the micro-expressions and body language indicators that preceded violent action, and every signal she was reading suggested that Hernandez was seconds from opening fire. "Command, this is Angel 9, she reported, her voice carrying new intensity. "Primary target is preparing to engage hostages. Repeat, imminent threat to civilian lives." The warehouse had become a powder keg with a lit fuse. In the next few seconds, someone would make a decision that would determine whether 17 innocent people went home to their families or became statistics in one of law enforcement's darkest hours. Park's team maintained their positions, weapons raised, ready to act on Commander Mitchell's orders. But the warehouse had become a chess game where every move could result in checkmate not for the players, but for 17 innocent pawns caught between opposing forces. The sound of approaching sirens from the north alley grew louder, indicating that Hernandez's backup was indeed approaching. Agent Kim, maintaining her overwatch position on the distant rooftop, provided crucial intelligence about the incoming threat. "Command, I count 3 vehicles approaching from the north. Estimate 6 to 8 additional hostiles, heavily armed. They'll reach the warehouse perimeter in approximately 2 minutes. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had begun as a carefully planned rescue operation had devolved into a potential siege scenario, with law enforcement caught between multiple threats while trying to protect civilian lives in a building rigged with explosives. Agent Martinez, still positioned behind industrial machinery with a clear view of both the hostages and Hernandez, made a tactical observation that would prove crucial. "Command, the hostages appeared to be zip-tied to support pillars in a specific pattern. It's possible Hernandez positioned them to maximize casualties if the explosives detonate." This revelation added another layer of horror to an already impossible situation. Hernandez hadn't just taken hostages, he had positioned them strategically to ensure maximum loss of life if his final contingency plan was executed. Agent Johnson, whose military experience included urban warfare in hostile territories, recognized the tactical sophistication of their opponents. "Sir,
This isn't a desperate last stand. This is a carefully planned fortress designed to inflict maximum casualties on law enforcement. The warehouse had been transformed into what military strategists call a killing funnel, a tactical space designed to channel enemy forces into predetermined zones where they could be eliminated efficiently. Every approach route, every piece of cover, every potential strategy had been anticipated and countered. Commander Mitchell, processing the rapidly changing intelligence, made the decision that would define the rest of the operation. All units were shifting to Protocol 7. This is no longer a rescue operation, it's a siege-breaking scenario. Protocol 7 was the FBI's most aggressive hostage rescue protocol, reserved for situations where traditional negotiation and tactical approaches had failed. It involved coordinated simultaneous assaults designed to overwhelm enemy defenses through speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. But Protocol 7 had never been attempted in a building rigged with explosives, with backup hostages approaching, and with 17 civilian lives hanging in the balance. The protocol assumed acceptable losses in exchange for mission success, a calculus that became morally complex when applied to innocent civilians. Park's team received their new orders with the grim professionalism that defined elite law enforcement units. They understood that the next few minutes would either result in a successful rescue that would be studied in training academies for decades, or a disaster that would haunt law enforcement for generations. Agent Santos, maintaining her sniper position, began identifying priority targets among the hostiles visible through the warehouse windows. Her precision rifle was capable of engaging multiple targets in rapid succession, but each shot would have to be perfect. Any miss could immediately result in retaliation against the helpless hostages. The approaching vehicle sounds grew louder, and Agent Kim provided updated intelligence. Command, lead vehicle is now visible, appears to be a modified pickup truck with mounted weapons. This is escalating beyond standard law enforcement capabilities. The warehouse operation had become something unprecedented in FBI history, a hostage rescue that was simultaneously a counterterrorism operation, an explosive ordnance disposal situation, and an urban warfare scenario. The complexity of variables had exceeded anything their training protocols had anticipated. Inside the warehouse, Hernandez could hear the approaching vehicles and understood that his backup was arriving. His demeanor shifted from desperate to confident as he realized that the tactical balance was about to change in his favor. "You hear that?" he called out to Park's team, his voice echoing through the industrial space. "My friends are coming, and they're bringing enough firepower to turn this place into your tomb." The hostages, already terrified beyond measure, began to understand that their ordeal was far from over. What they had hoped was a rescue operation was becoming a battle that could easily result in their deaths, regardless of who ultimately won.
Agent Park, crouched behind a conveyor belt system with his weapon trained on Far Hernandez's position, made a tactical assessment that would influence everything that followed. The arriving backup meant that his team would soon be outnumbered and outgunned, fighting in an environment that favored defenders over attackers. "Command," Park whispered into his throat microphone. "Request immediate support. We're about to be overwhelmed." The moment stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Agent Santos, her eye pressed against her scope, watched as Hernandez's finger began to tighten on the trigger. Through her high-powered optics, she could see the micro-movements that preceded lethal action. The slight tensing of his shoulder muscles, the adjustment of his stance, the cold calculation in his eyes as he prepared to execute innocent civilians. "Command, this is Angel 9, Santos whispered into her throat microphone, her voice carrying the weight of imminent tragedy. "Primary target is in firing position. I have a partial shot, but civilian proximity makes engagement extremely high risk." Commander Mitchell's response came immediately, his years of experience condensed into a single crucial decision. "Angel 9, you're authorized to engage if you assess imminent threat to civilian lives. Your call, Santos." Those words, "your call," transferred the weight of 17 lives onto the shoulders of a single FBI sniper positioned over 400 yards away from the target. Santos had made difficult shots before, but never with so many variables, never with innocent lives hanging in the balance of a single bullet's trajectory. Inside the warehouse, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Agent Park watched helplessly as Hernandez raised his weapon toward the bound hostages. James Sullivan, having freed himself from his restraints, was prepared to throw himself between the gunman and his fellow captives, knowing it would likely cost him his life. Federal agents,
"Drop your weapons," Hernandez screamed through the warehouse's industrial spaces. "Drop them now or I start killing hostages." Agent Johnson, positioned behind a concrete support pillar, had a clear line of sight to Hernandez but couldn't take the shot without risking hitting the civilians clustered behind the cartel leader. The tactical situation had become impossible. Every angle of approach put innocent lives at risk. Agent Martinez, fluent in Spanish and trained in crisis negotiation, made one final attempt to de-escalate the situation. "Carlos, escúchame," he called out, his voice carrying calm authority despite the chaos. "Listen to me. These people have families, children waiting for them at home. They're not your enemy." Hernandez's response was a burst of automatic weapon fire into the warehouse's ceiling, sending concrete fragments raining down on the terrified hostages. "No more talking. You have 10 seconds to drop your weapons or I start with the woman." He was referring to Patricia Morales, a 58-year-old security guard who had been working the night shift to earn extra money for her daughter's college tuition. She was bound to a support pillar approximately 6 feet from Hernandez, completely helpless and terrified. Agent Santos, maintaining her overwatch position, adjusted her scope for wind speed and distance. The shot would have to be perfect, threading between support beams, accounting for the slight angle of the warehouse floor, and striking a target who is using human shields for protection. "Entry Team Alpha, prepare for potential hostile down," Santos whispered into our microphone. "If I take this shot, you'll have approximately 3 seconds before his remaining men react." Park's team immediately shifted into position, ready to move the instant Hernandez was neutralized. But everyone understood the terrible mathematics of the situation. If Santos missed, or if her bullet didn't immediately incapacitate the target, Hernandez would have time to kill multiple hostages before being stopped. The additional hostile personnel that Agent Kim had spotted were now confirmed to be approaching the warehouse's north entrance. 3 armed men, likely Hernandez's backup, were attempting to reinforce their position. This meant that even if the immediate hostage situation was resolved, the tactical team would still face additional threats. "Command, this is Overwatch 2, Agent Kim reported from her rooftop position. Additional hostiles are 30 seconds from north entrance. Entry Team Alpha will be caught between multiple threats." Commander Mitchell felt the situation spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control. Multiple armed threats, 17 hostages, explosive devices throughout the building, and a primary target who was seconds away from committing mass murder. It was the kind of scenario that kept law enforcement commanders awake at night. Inside the warehouse, James Sullivan made eye contact with Patricia Morales and several other hostages. Using subtle hand gestures, he indicated that when the shooting started, and everyone now understood it was inevitable, they should drop to the floor and crawl toward the eastern wall where concrete barriers would provide some protection. Hernandez began his countdown, his voice echoing through the warehouse like a death sentence. 10, 9, 8. Agent Santos took a deep breath, her finger resting lightly on the trigger of her precision rifle. The shot would have to travel 427 yards, through industrial air thick with dust and moisture, between steel support beams and strike a target who was partially concealed behind innocent civilians. 7, 6, 5. Park's team tensed like coiled springs, ready to move the instant they received the signal. Johnson had shifted position to cover the north entrance, where additional hostiles were approaching. Williams maintained overwatch on the remaining cartel members in the warehouse. Martinez prepared to move immediately toward the hostages for medical assessment and evacuation. 4, 3. Santos made her final calculations, accounting for every variable she could measure and several she had to estimate. Wind speed at the target area, the slight movement of the warehouse structure, the probability that Hernandez would shift position at the last second, all of these factors had to be processed in the span of heartbeats. 2. The warehouse fell into an eerie silence except for the sound of Hernandez's countdown and the terrified breathing of 17 people who believed they were about to die. Angel 9 taking the shot.
The .308 Winchester round left Agent Santos's rifle with a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, traveling the 427 yards to its target in just over half a second. In that brief span of time, 17 lives hung in the balance, suspended between salvation and tragedy by the trajectory of a single bullet. Santos had aimed for what snipers call the apricot, the small area of the brainstem where a precise hit would cause instant incapacitation, preventing any reflexive muscle contractions that might still allow Hernandez to pull his trigger. It was a shot that required not just exceptional marksmanship, but perfect timing and a degree of luck that even the best snipers rarely counted on. The bullet struck Hernandez in the base of his skull just as he reached 1 in his countdown. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. His body collapsed like a marionette with severed strings, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the warehouse floor as his finger lost all motor control. Target down, target down! Agent Johnson's voice crackled through the radio as Park's team immediately sprang into action. The 3-second window Santos had predicted became a chaotic rush of movement as law enforcement officers converged on the hostages, while simultaneously preparing for the additional threats approaching from the north. James Sullivan, who had been preparing to throw himself between Hernandez and the other hostages, immediately began helping the bound civilians drop to the floor and seek cover behind concrete barriers. His quick thinking and physical preparation potentially saved several lives as Hernandez's remaining men began firing wildly in response to their leader's death. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" Agent Martinez shouted as he moved toward the hostages, his weapon raised and ready. But the remaining cartel members, 3 men positioned throughout the warehouse, had no intention of surrendering. The warehouse erupted into a firefight that transformed the industrial space into a war zone. Muzzle flashes strobed through the darkness as automatic weapons chattered, sending bullets ricocheting off concrete walls and steel machinery. The hostages, now freed from their immediate death threat, found themselves caught in a crossfire that was arguably more dangerous than their original situation. Agent Kim, monitoring from her overwatch position, provided crucial intelligence as the battle developed. "Command, north entrance hostiles are now inside the building. Count 3 additional tangos, heavily armed, moving toward the main floor." Park's team found themselves fighting a 2-front battle: Hernandez's original men who were still positioned throughout the warehouse, and the reinforcements who were attempting to reach the main floor from the north stairwell. The tactical situation had become exponentially more complex, and the presence of 17 civilian hostages made every engagement decision potentially fatal. "Williams, cover the north approach," Park commanded as he moved toward a group of hostages who were trapped behind inadequate cover. "Johnson, suppress fire from the west machinery cluster." Agent Johnson, drawing on his military experience in urban warfare, laid down precise covering fire that forced the cartel gunmen to take cover, rather than advancing on the hostages' position. His disciplined shooting and tactical movement created enough breathing room for Martinez to begin evacuating civilians toward the more secure eastern section of the warehouse. But the explosives remained an ever-present threat. Every burst of gunfire, every grenade, if anyone chose to use them, every tactical decision had to account for the possibility of triggering devices that could bring down the entire structure. Lieutenant Rodriguez, monitoring from the command center, provided constant updates on the explosive signatures he was detecting. "All units, be advised that we're reading increased electromagnetic activity consistent with remote detonation preparation. Someone may be attempting to trigger the explosives manually." The implication was terrifying. Even with Hernandez dead, someone else might have access to the detonation controls. Whether it was one of his lieutenants or the approaching reinforcements, the building could still become a tomb for everyone inside. Agent Santos, having taken the shot that neutralized the primary threat, quickly adjusted her position to provide overwatch support for the ongoing firefight. Through her scope, she could see Park's team moving tactically through the warehouse while attempting to shield the civilians from the crossfire. "Command, this is Angel 9. I have visual on 2 hostiles in the west machinery area, requesting permission to engage." "Negative, Angel 9. Too much friendly movement in your field of fire. Maintain overwatch. And report." The hostages, led by James Sullivan's quick thinking and natural leadership, had managed to reach a more defensible position behind concrete loading dock barriers. Patricia Morales, despite her terrifying ordeal, was helping other civilians move away from the active firefighting zone. Agent Martinez, trained in both tactical medicine and hostage psychology, was making rapid assessments of the civilians' conditions while simultaneously maintaining security awareness. "Command, hostages appear physically unharmed, but several are showing signs of severe psychological trauma. We need medical personnel standing by for immediate treatment." The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was actually less than 3 minutes. Professional law enforcement training and superior positioning gradually overwhelmed the cartel gunmen, but without cost. Agent Williams took a grazing wound to his shoulder from a ricocheting bullet, and 2 of the hostages suffered minor injuries from flying concrete fragments. When the last hostile weapon fell silent, the warehouse was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the dust of pulverized concrete. 17 civilians had survived one of the most dangerous hostage situations in FBI history. But the operation was far from over. The explosives were still armed, the building was structurally compromised from the firefight, and somewhere in the chaos, someone might still have the ability to trigger a device that would kill everyone who had just risked their lives to save innocent people.
The silence that followed the firefight was more unsettling than the gunfire itself. Agent Park's team moved methodically through the warehouse, clearing each section while maintaining protective positions around the 17 hostages who huddled behind concrete barriers in the building's eastern section. The smell of cordite hung heavy in the air, and broken glass crunched underfoot as they navigated between industrial machinery that now bore the scars of high-velocity rounds. "Command, this is Entry Team Alpha," Park reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "All hostile contacts neutralized, hostages secure, but we still have the explosive threat to deal with." Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice crackled through their earpieces with information that sent chills down everyone's spine. "Entry Team Alpha, be advised that electromagnetic readings are still active. The explosive devices remain armed, and we're detecting what appears to be a timer mechanism that was initiated during the firefight." The implications were staggering. Even with all the gunmen neutralized, the warehouse had become a ticking time bomb. Whether the timer had been triggered intentionally by one of Hernandez's men or activated automatically as a failsafe, everyone inside the building was now racing against an unknown countdown. Agent Martinez was moving among the hostages, conducting rapid medical assessments while trying to keep them calm despite the new threat. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to stay exactly where you are while we assess the situation. You're safe from the immediate threat, but we need to be very careful about how we evacuate." James Sullivan, who had shown remarkable leadership throughout the ordeal, spoke for the group. "Agent, how much time do we have?" It was the question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to ask. Martinez looked toward Park, who was receiving updates from the command center through his earpiece. "Rodriguez, what's your best estimate on the timer mechanism?" Park asked quietly, hoping the hostages couldn't hear his conversation. "Sir, based on the electromagnetic signatures, I'm reading what appears to be a 15-minute countdown that initiated approximately 4 minutes ago. That gives us maybe 11 minutes to evacuate everyone safely." 11 minutes to move 17 civilians and 4 law enforcement officers through a building rigged with explosives, down into basement tunnels and out to safety. Under normal circumstances, it would be manageable, but these weren't normal circumstances. Several of the hostages were elderly, at least 2 were showing signs of shock, and the building's structural integrity had been compromised by the firefight. Agent Santos, maintaining her overwatch position, had a clear view of the warehouse exterior and the evacuation routes that would need to be used. "Command, this is Angel 9. I'm observing increased activity from emergency medical personnel and bomb disposal units. Are we evacuating through the tunnel system?" Command Mitchell's response carried the weight of a man making life and death calculations in real time. "Negative, Angel 9. Rodriguez advises that moving through the tunnels could trigger pressure-sensitive devices. We're going with a surface evacuation through the north loading dock." The north loading dock was the farthest point from where most of the explosive devices were concentrated, but it also meant moving the hostages through 200 feet of potentially dangerous territory. Every step could be their last if they triggered a device that had been missed in the initial sweep. Agent Johnson, despite his shoulder wound, was already scouting the evacuation route. "Command, north loading dock is clear, but we have significant debris from the firefight blocking the most direct path. We'll need to navigate around several machinery clusters." Park made the decision that would later be analyzed and debated in after-action reports for years to come. Rather than moving the hostages as a single group, which would be faster but create a larger target if something went wrong, he decided to evacuate them in small groups of 3 to 4 people each. "Martinez, take the first group. Prioritize anyone with medical concerns or mobility issues. Johnson, despite your wound, you're covering the route. Williams, stay with the remaining hostages while I coordinate with bomb disposal." Patricia Morales, the security guard who had come closest to being executed, was in the first group along with 2 dock workers who were showing signs of shock. As Martinez led them carefully through the warehouse debris field, every footstep seemed to echo ominously through the building. Agent Santos provided overwatch coverage, her scope scanning for any signs of additional threats while simultaneously watching for emergency vehicles positioned to receive the evacuees.
Command, first group is moving toward north exit. Medical personnel are standing by. The evacuation proceeded with agonizing slowness as each group navigated through the obstacle course the warehouse had become. Broken machinery, scattered ammunition, and the bodies of the neutralized cartel members created a maze that required careful navigation under extreme time pressure. Rodriguez, time check, Park requested, as the second group began their movement. Sir, approximately 7 minutes remaining on our estimate. 7 minutes for 2 more groups, plus Park himself and Williams, who would be the last to evacuate? The mathematics were getting uncomfortably tight, especially considering that the timer estimate was just that, an estimate based on electronic signatures rather than visual confirmation of an actual device. James Sullivan, who had been designated as the leader of the third evacuation group, was helping support an elderly janitor named Roberto, who was having difficulty walking due to hours of being bound in an uncomfortable position. "We're going to make it," he told the man in both English and Spanish, his voice carrying a confidence he didn't entirely feel. But as the third group began their movement toward the north loading dock, Agent Santos spotted something through her scope that made her blood run cold. "Command, this is Angel 9. I have visual on what appears to be a blinking light in the warehouse's southwest corner. Repeat, possible explosive device with visible timer." The countdown was no longer theoretical. It was real, visible, and ticking away the final minutes of everyone's lives.
The blinking red light that Agent Santos had spotted through her scope transformed the evacuation from urgent to desperate. Commander Mitchell's voice cut through the radio chatter with stark clarity. "All units, visible timer confirmed in southwest corner. Rodriguez estimates 4 minutes maximum until detonation." 4 minutes to evacuate the remaining hostages, clear all law enforcement personnel, and get everyone far enough from the warehouse to survive the explosion. Park looked at the 8 people still clustered behind the concrete barriers. Williams, 3 dock workers, 2 cleaning staff, the elderly janitor Roberto, and James Sullivan, who had refused to leave until everyone else was safe. "Williams, forget protocol," Park commanded, "removing everyone together, right now." Agent Martinez, who had successfully evacuated the first 2 groups, was already heading back into the warehouse, despite orders to maintain safe distance. "Sir, I'm coming back to assist with the final group." "Negative, Martinez. Stay with the evacuees and coordinate medical treatment." But Martinez was already moving, his commitment to leaving no one behind overriding his concern for personal safety. It was a decision that exemplified the best of law enforcement culture, the willingness to risk everything for others. Inside the warehouse, Williams was helping Roberto to his feet while James Sullivan assisted the 2 cleaning staff members, both women in their 50s, who were still traumatized by hours of captivity. The blinking light in the southwest corner seemed to pulse faster with each passing second, though Park knew that was likely his imagination under extreme stress. Agent Santos, maintaining overwatch, had shifted her scope to scan for the safest evacuation route. "Command, north loading dock is clear, but I'm seeing what might be another device near the main entrance. Recommend extreme caution on the evacuation path." The warehouse had become a maze of potential death traps, with explosive devices that could detonate from timer mechanisms, pressure plates, or remote triggers that might still be in the hands of unknown hostile personnel. Every step the evacuation group took could potentially be their last. "Rodriguez, give me a real-time countdown," Park requested as his group began moving toward the north loading dock. "Sir, based on the visible timer Santos reported, approximately 3 minutes and 20 seconds. But these devices could be networked. If one goes off, it might trigger all of them simultaneously." The group moved as quickly as the elderly janitor's pace would allow, with Williams and Sullivan providing physical support while Park maintained security overwatch. The 200 feet to the north loading dock stretched ahead of them like an impossible distance under the circumstances. Agent Johnson, despite his shoulder wound, had positioned himself at the halfway point to provide covering positions and assistance. 50 feet to my position. Everyone's doing great, just keep moving." Roberto, the janitor, who had been working at the warehouse for 15 years, was struggling with each step. The hours of being bound had affected his circulation, and his legs were cramping severely.
James Sullivan, without hesitation, simply picked up the smaller man and carried him, refusing to leave anyone behind despite the mortal danger to himself. "Command, this is Angel 9, Santos reported, her voice carrying new urgency. "Timer display is now visible through my scope, showing 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Commander Mitchell, monitoring from the mobile command center, was coordinating the emergency response for what everyone now understood would be a massive explosion. "All units, prepare for building collapse. Medical teams, stand by for potential casualties. Bomb disposal, maintain safe distance. This is no longer a disarmament situation." The evacuation group reached Johnson's position with 2 minutes and 20 seconds remaining on the timer. They were halfway to safety, but the most difficult terrain lay ahead. An area cluttered with debris from the firefight and machinery that had been damaged during the operation. Agent Martinez, despite orders to maintain safe distance, had reached the north loading dock and was coordinating the final reception point. "Command, I have clear sight lines to the evacuation group. Estimated 90 seconds to reach safe evacuation point." 90 seconds to cover the remaining distance, but the timer showed less than 2 minutes remaining. The mathematics of survival were becoming impossibly tight, complicated by Roberto's physical condition and the treacherous footing in the warehouse's debris field. "Williams, take point. I'll bring up the rear with Roberto and Sullivan." It was then that James Sullivan made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Looking at the timer visible in the distance, calculating the group's pace, and understanding that they were cutting the evacuation impossibly close, he made a choice that prioritized others over himself. "Agent Park," Sullivan said quietly, "I'm going to stay back and make sure that timer doesn't have any manual override switches. Get Roberto and the others out." "Absolutely not," Park replied immediately. "We all go together or nobody goes." But Sullivan had already set Roberto down in Williams' arms and was moving back toward the warehouse interior. "That timer might have a manual trigger as backup. Someone needs to make sure it doesn't get activated early." Agent Santos, watching through her scope, saw Sullivan moving against the evacuation flow. "Command, one of the hostages is moving toward potential explosive devices. Repeat, hostage is moving toward potential explosive devices." The final 90 seconds of the evacuation had become a race between human courage and mechanical destruction, with 17 lives already saved, and one man choosing to risk everything to ensure they stayed safe. The timer continued its relentless countdown. 1 minute and 37 seconds. 1 minute and 36 seconds. 1 minute and 35 seconds. 1 minute and 23 seconds remained on the timer when Agent Park made the decision that would define his career and his conscience for the rest of his life. Rather than allowing James Sullivan to sacrifice himself, Park handed Roberto to Williams and sprinted back into the warehouse after the civilian who had already saved so many lives that night. "Sullivan, stop!" Park's voice echoed through the industrial space as he pursued the dock worker who was moving with surprising speed toward the southwest corner where the timer's red light blinked its ominous countdown. Agent Santos, watching through her scope, provided real-time updates to the command center. "Command, Agent Park has re-entered the building in pursuit of the civilian, timer showing 1 minute and 15 seconds. James Sullivan reached the explosive device, a sophisticated array of C4 charges wired to what appeared to be a cell phone timer mechanism. His years of working around industrial equipment had taught him to recognize different types of electrical systems, and what he saw made his blood run cold. "Agent Park!" Sullivan called out as the FBI agent reached his position. "This isn't just a timer. There's a backup manual switch. Someone could trigger this remotely even if we got past the countdown." Park looked at the device, his training allowing him to quickly assess the situation. Sullivan was right. The explosive array had multiple triggering mechanisms, including what appeared to be a cell phone that could receive a detonation signal from anywhere in the world. "Can you disable it?" Park asked, knowing they had less than a minute to make a decision that would affect everyone who had already evacuated. Sullivan examined the wiring with the confidence of a man who had spent decades working with electrical systems under pressure. "Maybe, but if I'm wrong, this thing goes off immediately." 58 seconds on the timer. Agent Martinez, positioned at the north loading dock with the evacuated hostages, was watching the warehouse with growing horror. "Command, request permission to re-enter building and assist Agent Park." "Negative!" Commander Mitchell's voice was firm despite the emotional weight of the situation. "We cannot risk additional personnel." Inside the warehouse, Sullivan made his decision. Agent Park, you need to leave. Get back to your team. Not happening, Park replied, crouching next to Sullivan as the dock worker began carefully examining the device's wiring. Tell me what you need. 45 seconds. Red wire goes to the timer, blue wire to the cell phone trigger, green wire to what looks like a pressure backup. If I cut the wrong one, we're both dead. If I cut the right ones in the right order, everyone lives. Agent Santos, maintaining overwatch, was reporting every second of the countdown. 38 seconds, Command. Both subjects still in the building. The warehouse had become a cathedral of tension, with two men crouched over an explosive device that could level the entire structure. Sullivan's hands were steady despite the circumstances, drawing on decades of experience working with electrical systems under pressure. Red wire first, Sullivan muttered, more to himself than to Park. Disable the pressure backup. He carefully cut the red wire with a pair of pliers he had retrieved from his tool belt, equipment he carried as part of his regular dock work that had now become instruments of salvation. 30 seconds. The timer continued its countdown, unaffected by the severing of the pressure backup system. Sullivan moved to the blue wire, which would disable the remote cell phone trigger. If this goes wrong, Sullivan said quietly, tell my wife Maria that I was thinking about her and the kids. Tell her yourself, Park replied. Cut the wire. 22 seconds. Sullivan severed the blue wire, and for a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The timer continued its relentless countdown, but the cell phone component went dark, eliminating the remote trigger threat. Last wire, Sullivan announced, positioning his pliers around the red wire that connected the timer to the explosive charges. This either stops everything or kills us both. 15 seconds. Agent Santos, watching through her scope, saw Sullivan raise the pliers. Command, civilian is attempting to disarm the device. Timer shows 14 seconds. Commander Mitchell, helpless to affect the outcome from the mobile command center, could only watch and wait as two men he barely knew risked everything to save lives that had already been rescued. 10 seconds. Sullivan cut the red wire. The timer display went dark immediately, its red digital numbers disappearing into black silence. For a moment that stretched like eternity, both men stared at the device, waiting to see if Sullivan's electrical expertise had been sufficient to prevent disaster. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 30. Command, this is Entry Team Alpha. Park's voice came through the radio with carefully controlled relief. Explosive device has been successfully disarmed. All personnel safe. The warehouse erupted in cheers from the law enforcement personnel positioned outside, while the 17 evacuated hostages wept with relief, exhaustion, and gratitude. James Sullivan, a dock worker who had started his shift thinking about overtime pay and getting home to his family, had become the unexpected hero of one of the FBI's most complex rescue operations. Agent Santos, finally able to leave her overwatch position after hours of maintaining deadly focus, packed her rifle and headed to the warehouse to join the celebration and debriefing that would follow. Commander Mitchell, reviewing the operation that had lasted less than 6 hours but felt like a lifetime, began the mental process of writing reports that would document how 17 innocent lives had been saved through a combination of professional law enforcement work and extraordinary civilian courage. 3 months later, James Sullivan received the FBI's Civilian Service Award in a ceremony attended by all 17 hostages he had helped save. Agent Park received a commendation for outstanding service, while Agent Santos's precision shot was studied in training academies as an example of surgical accuracy under impossible conditions. The warehouse was demolished 2 weeks after the operation, but the lessons learned from Operation Angel 9 became part of FBI training protocols for hostage rescue situations involving explosives. Most importantly, the operation proved that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary acts of courage. Patricia Morales returned to her security job and eventually saved enough money to send her daughter to college. Roberto, the elderly janitor, retired with full benefits and spent his remaining years telling anyone who would listen about the night FBI agents and a dock worker named James Sullivan saved his life. And in FBI training facilities across the country, instructors still teach new agents about the night when someone said Angel 9 taking the shot, and how a single bullet, fired with surgical precision, saved 17 lives and proved that courage comes in many forms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.